Thank you so much, Kevin, for that generous introduction. I joked with Kevin earlier, he could have been a lot more efficient and quick in his introduction if he had just said, this is Boyd Taylor Coolman, and he's the husband of Holly Taylor. That's a shout out to Holly, who's behind that screen somewhere, I think. So thanks to Kevin for the introduction, but also thank you for the invitation to give this plenary address. And I also just want to take a moment and thank Kevin for his labor and toil to year in and year out, all these many years to bring us together here at the PMR. I know from my own conference organizing experience how much work is involved in that. And so actually, would you just join me in thanking you? I'm happy and I'm humbled to count Kevin as a colleague, a co-worker, but also a brother and a friend. It's great to be here. I am really looking forward to our time together this evening and the conversation. It's been a great experience already to be in the various sessions yesterday and today. It's fun for me to remember that the PMR was the site of my very first academic paper presentation in 1995, a while ago. It's an honor also to give this plenary address and to stand in the place where so many other fine scholars, including Catherine Coneybear from yesterday, amazing lecture, which I will not be able to follow. But also a pleasure just to be here and to have this conversation. And I look forward to continuing the conversation after I add my widow's mite. It's already been a rich feast of conversation. In an underappreciated article, Mystical Consciousness, a Modest Proposal, Bernard McGinn distinguishes spirituality and mysticism. Kevin, the handout. We got to get sorry. The handout coming that's necessary for me before I can proceed. All right, let me try that again.
Sorry about that.
No worries. In an underappreciated article, Mystical Consciousness, a Modest Proposal, Bernie McGinn distinguishes spirituality and mysticism. Spirituality is a broader term, quote, signifying the whole range of beliefs and practices by which the Christian church strives to live out its commitment to the spirits and present in the risen Christ, end quote. More narrowly, mysticism is an integral element within spirituality, namely, and this is the first text on your handout, quote, the inner and hidden realization of spirituality through a transforming consciousness of God's immediate presence. Mysticism, or more precisely, the mystical element within Christian spirituality, is the goal to which spiritual practices aim, end quote. This transforming consciousness of God's immediate presence is often called mystical experience. McGinn, however, deems experience an unhelpful interpretive category, since the term is both ambiguous and often reductionistic, implying that the transforming consciousness of God's presence is reducible to some, quote, originating pure feeling, sensation, or experience, end quote. As an alternative, McGinn proposes that analyses of medieval mystical texts utilize Bernard McGinn's category of consciousness. which affords, quote, a more adequate theoretic basis for investigating mysticism, and also provides one that provides a better insight into the writings of the mystics themselves. Mystical consciousness, quote 2 on your handout, McGinn writes, is a fruitful way to conceive of the forms of special encounter with God spoken of by Christian mystics, primarily because consciousness, as Lonergan understands it, emphasizes the entire process of human intentionality and self-presence, rather than just an originating pure feeling, sensation, or experience, easily separable from subsequent acts of thinking, loving, and deciding, end quote. For him, the utility of mystical consciousness lies in its capacity to locate the mystical within a broader account of human existence and in relationship to the multiple dimensions of consciousness, or what has been aptly termed the polymorphism of human consciousness. McGinn's proposal invites scholars to deploy a Lonerganian notion of consciousness in their analysis of ancient mystical authors and texts. One such author chosen here, namely Thomas Gallus, or is Thomas Gallus. Despite the 7 centuries separating them, Gallus and Lonergan posit strikingly similar accounts of polymorphic human consciousness, especially consciousness of God. Generally, they both offer ways of conceiving of the relationship between mystical consciousness on the one hand, and on the other, the whole human person in all its dimensions, intellectual, affective, moral, social, even political. More precisely, in their analyses of human God consciousness, including mystical consciousness, both thinkers grant a certain preeminence to love. At the same time, they both strive to relate love to all the other dimensions of human consciousness, especially the intellectual or the rational, in such wise that love can be seen to permeate or saturate them, while not suppressing or reducing them to itself. In short, I shall argue that both offer paradigms for what might aptly be labeled love-saturated God consciousness. To Gallus. Born in the late 12th century, perhaps in France, Thomas Gallus was teaching at St. Victor in Paris in the first 2 decades of the 13th century, and then in northern Italy until his death in 1246. He's often named the last of the great medieval Victorines after Hugh and Richard. He also had a lifelong obsession with the Dionysian corpus, on which he wrote multiple commentaries. He also wrote at least 2 commentaries on the Song of Songs, which commentaries are profoundly Dionysian in character. And his originality as a thinker emerges from his creative interpretive fusion of the Dionysian corpus and the Song of Songs. Arguably, the most distinctive aspect of Gallus's theology is his account of the soul, namely its nature, its powers, and acts, especially in relationship to God. Gallus derives his anthropology from his metaphysics, in this case, the Neoplatonic metaphysics of Dionysius. More precisely, his account of created reality is governed by a threefold metaphysical dynamism of procession, remaining, and return. And this provides the framework for the relationship between God and all that is not God, including the human creature. With respect to rational creatures, these 3 metaphysical dimensions acquire distinct expression. Metaphysical procession takes the form of a descending movement or vector within the soul, and a radical receptivity for receiving the divine inflowing from above. Metaphysical return finds its anthropological expression in an ascending movement or vector, an upward thrusting, ultimately self-transcending movement of the soul toward and into God. Metaphysical remaining, lastly, describes how through these simultaneously descending and ascending modes, the rational creature achieves a state of order, stability, and simplicity, enabling maximal relationship to God. Gallus concretely expresses this dynamic anthropology by conceiving of the soul quite literally as a hierarchy in the specific Dionysian sense of that term, namely, quote, a sacred order, a state of understanding, and an activity approximating as closely as possible to the divine, or perhaps more plainly, a Dionysian hierarchy is a dynamic structure or order involving both knowledge and activity, which conducts toward and unites to God. In a hierarchized soul, then, there are ascending and descending vectors, which together constitute a dynamic equilibrium remaining. But here, Gallus innovates further as he appropriates Dionysius's conception of the angelic hierarchy as a model for understanding the nature of the soul. Taking a cue from the Areopagite, Gallus posits a hierarchical structure within the soul analogous to the angels. And here I draw your attention to the screen. This angelization of the mind is as follows. The lowest triad of the hierarchy, the angels, the archangels, and the principalities, corresponds to the basic nature of the soul and its wholly natural capacities and acts. The middle triad, powers, virtues, and dominions, names these same basic powers as assisted by grace. And finally, the highest triad, the thrones, the cherubim, and the seraphim, is the realm of grace above nature and involves ecstasy in the literal sense of transcending the mind itself. Gallus thus angelizes the soul, positing the angelic hierarchy as the macrocosmic model of the individual soul. It's in this way that the soul is a hierarchic entity. You probably never knew that you had your own principalities and powers. Let alone your own seraphim and cherubim. Now, while Gallus's angelic anthropology may strike modern readers as bizarre, they should look past the angelic trappings to its hierarchical structure, with its diverse but ordered and interrelated modes and levels of activity. With this hierarchical anthropology, Gallus has a framework for conceiving of both the polymorphic nature of human consciousness and also a particular relationship between knowledge and love. His hierarchized soul is governed by two principles that are suitably labeled assimilating sublimation in the ascending vector and cascading illumination in the descending vector. In the ascending vector, assimilating sublimation describes how the lower is taken up into the higher according to the capacity of the higher. In the descending vector, cascading illumination describes how the higher redounds to the lower according to the capacity of the lower. Each, moreover, produces an important effect in the soul, namely simplification in the ascending vector and instigation in the descending. And it's these hierarchical dynamics that govern the love-knowledge relationship. Now, to appreciate the sublimating dynamic, first of all, it's necessary to consider the distinct cognitional acts and capacities that Gallus posits and arranges in the soul. To begin, Gallus affirms the possibility of a certain kind of knowledge of God that is derived from created things, which he correlates to the dominions or the sixth angelic rank. It's really just the upper echelons here that will be of interest to us. We'll start with the sixth rank. The sixth rank is the topmost of the middle triad. For Gallus, the sphere of natural human capacity assisted by grace. This dominical knowledge of the Creator is mediated by created effects. Invoking Romans 1:19 and 20, Gallus calls it the mirror of creatures, quote unquote. On one hand, it's knowledge of God derived from philosophical speculation based on natural reason. And Gallus explicitly praises Aristotle as the preeminent practitioner of this. On the other hand, the notion of ascending through visible to invisible things is a venerable principle of Victorine theology going back to Hugh. And this kind of knowledge is thus the proper object of both philosophical and theological speculation. It falls within the grasp of the natural intellect. The soul gains it by actively extracting knowledge from the created world through which the nature of God can be inferred. Gallus is a metaphysical exemplarist. What the soul extracts from sensible things are the divine ideas, which he calls theoriae in the plural. Existing preeminently in the simplicity of the word, the divine word, these theoriae are also present in diversified multiplicity in all created things. By knowing them, the soul gains a kind of knowledge of God. This mode we might term or call scientific, broadly defined. The mind is facing downward and outward towards the external creation, whence it extracts knowledge of God. This knowledge is acquired by rational effort. It falls within the natural capacities of the soul and is mediated by empirical observation and by concepts drawn from created things. The soul stands in some sense over and above its objects. Its proper act is extractive and abstractive. Its goal is to possess through conceptual grasp. Gallus calls it wine extracted from grapes. This cognition, however, is at the limits of the soul's strictly natural capacities, even assisted by grace. Yet the impulse of its hierarchical nature, Godward, does not allow it to rest. Rather, it strains for more. And Gallus characterizes this posture with the language of suspension, which has a double meaning. On the one hand, it means stretching and extending. Quote, suspension is the stretching of the mind into the super resplendent theoriae, up into the high points of the order of the dominions of the mind, end quote. At the same time, suspension has the more colloquial sense for us of stoppage. Quote, the high points of the affect and the intellect are suspended here in all their power for the reception of the divine visitations from above. So, since the soul is unwilling to rest, she suspends herself, says Gallus, in the order of dominions, and she begs to be drawn higher, for no one comes to the Father who is not drawn, John 6. Aptly, Gallus captures this posture with the language of lingering. Lingering in the dominions, he says, therefore, contemplating the beauty of the divine as much as she can in a mirror, the soul desires to be united to the first beauty above. Importantly, the imagery of lingering suggests an aptness for being taken up into a higher level. And Gallus captures this in some maternal and horticultural metaphors. Quote, he says, the lower hierarchy is said to be a kind of mother, since it gives birth to the fundamental movements of the superior orders. Or again, all knowledge, scientia, and the edifice of virtue are laid upon the foundation of this nature, and yet they are not consummated without the benefit of divine light and heat, i.e. grace. These images suggest that dominical knowledge or cognition is preparatory for and able to be upwardly assimilated by and even accumulated into a higher level. Above dominical knowledge, then, Gallus posits another form of knowledge, which he associates with the thrones and especially with the cherubim, the eighth and penultimate rank of the entire hierarchy. Here, entirely above nature, the soul is entirely dependent on and responsive to the gracious initiative of a divine gracious initiative to operate at this level. And so while dominical knowledge, says Gallus, is sober within the reach of natural capacities, cherubic knowledge is ecstatic, it's supernatural, it's beyond nature. And Gallus captures all this in nuptial imagery, the nuptial imagery of the Songs. The soul bride must await the visitation of the bridegroom. She must be drawn rather than initiate. And then I'll quote 3 on your handout. The synderesis, the high point of the soul, is now no longer convex, we might say, oriented downward toward creation, extracting wine from grapes through the age and intellect. Rather, it is now a concavity, a sinus mentis, opened upwards, receiving, says Gallus, milk from the breast of the word, that is to say, the theoria flowing into the bride from her intimate union with Christ in the Spirit. Here, the soul is receptive rather than extractive. Here, the intellectus receives the divine theoria interiorly. The beloved's bundle of myrrh represents the many theoria, sweet smelling above the mind, flowing from the simple unity of the word. Commenting on the verse, your breasts are better than wine, Gallus reads wine as dominical knowledge derived from the cognition of all existing things. Breasts, by contrast, stand for the most fertile and superabundant fullness of divine wisdom that flows from the bridegroom. Rather than objectively scientific, thus this knowledge is subjective and interpersonal. By the way, you may have noticed in some of these quotations, I'm just giving you my whole paragraph with Gallus quotes woven into the prose, just for simplicity's sake. Despite the differences then between these 2 forms of knowledge, however, there are points of continuity between them. It's the same power of the soul, the intellectus, that is operative in both, and both have a common object, namely the divine exemplars or theoria. But the most significant aspect of continuity pertains to what Gallus calls simplification. This is text 4. Drawn to the super simple spouse, the powers of the soul begin to be simplified. Quote, the subtle movements of the mind extending toward supernal things are simplified in the contemplation of the super simple word. The result is an intellectual vision that is, quote, most greatly simplified, and an intellectus contractus, a contracted intellect. This seems to involve a transition from discursive reasoning to a more direct and immediate intellectual intuition into the divine theoria. Reason, says Gallus, palpates, I love this image, palpates, as it were, what it manually considers, by analyzing and examining. By contrast, the cherubic intellect considers and sees by contemplating directly. The intellectus has a simple gaze in this mode. In light of all this, I would argue that cherubic cognition is best understood according to the hierarchic principle of assimilating simplification. Ascending, the lower is exceeded and thus transcended, but also in some sense assimilated or rolled up into a higher modality. For all that, though, both dominical and cherubic cognition remain intellectual, bound by the finitude of the intellectual power. That's 5 on your handout. And so here, the soul confronts the final failure of the intellect. For the attracted intellect does not pass this, but has here the consummation of its knowledge and light. At this point, it is necessary for intellectual activities to be, as it were, stopped, as they are not capable of progressing further. This is the death of the intellect. Hence, Exodus 33 says, man shall not see me and live. This sets the stage for an affective union. Quote, contemplating the spouse on the day of his espousals, the bride in the order of the cherubim makes, as it were, a final preparation so that she may be led into the inmost bed of the bridegroom. Cherubic intellection prepares for the highest and final mode of consciousness, namely seraphic affection or love. Gallus's description of the ninth and seraphic rank merits extended quotation, and this is quote 6. The ninth order contains the principle sighing for God, the super intellectual stretchings and insendings, burning brilliances and brilliant burnings. The understanding cannot be drawn to the excessive sublimities and sublime excesses of all these, but only the principal affection can be united to God. This order embraces God and is surrounded by the embraces of the bridegroom. And from this order, the flood of the divine light flows into the lower orders one by one. Of much that could be noted in this passage, the following are the most germane. First, the faculty in play is what Gallus calls the principal affection, or affectus, a capacity for direct and in some sense unmediated contact with God, embracing and embraced the point of union. Secondly, the affectus has a receptive, passive dimension, which is evident in the use of the passive participle affectus. To be affected is to be acted upon, to receive, to undergo, to suffer contact, to be touched. Simply put, the affectus is the soul's capacity to be thus affected by God. It's that by which the soul is most capable, or capax Dei. Thirdly, all the activities of the intellectus are apparently barred from entry. The affectus alone operates here. This level, quote, suspends the activity of the senses, of imagination, of reason, of intellect, both practical and theoretical, and excludes every understanding and every intelligible. Love and love alone enters in, where knowledge remains outside. For Gallus, God is not wholly intelligible, but God is wholly lovable. But in what precisely does this affective encounter with the word consist? I would argue that it is a super intellectual, experiential perception that is a unique form of knowing, what Gallus calls an affective cognitio Dei. And while he associates it with what Dionysius had called the most divine knowledge of God, which is through ignorance, from the mystical theology, affective cognition is not, for Gallus, a total absence of all awareness or perception. Rather, text 7 on your handout, Gallus says, we experience, my emphasis, through ignorance, by suspending every rational operation and intellectual cognition according to a union above the mind through the exceeding of one's own mind. What kind of experience is this? Gallus calls it an experiential cognition. Quote, through unitive conjoining and experiential cognition, the word impresses vestiges of himself, as it were, upon those who are suffering divine things. And you recognize the reference to Hierarchy. Now, to explain this super intellectual cognition, Gallus adopts a teaching on the spiritual senses of the soul. The affectus, he says, tastes, touches, and smells spiritually, while the intellectus merely sees and hears. End quote. Intellectual cognition reflects the mediating distance between knower and known, entailed in seeing and hearing, while affective cognition has the immediacy found in smell, taste, and touch. For Gallus, text 8, this is a genuine form of cognition. Quote, insofar as we thus taste, touch, and embrace and smell God, to that extent do we cognize him, by ineffably participating in his sweetness and suavity, end quote. Furthermore, this cognition has the same objects as the other forms, the same divine theorii that the intellectus cognizes, but now in a different modality through the spiritual senses. Quote, the best ointments are the super intellectual theorii, which soothe the minds united to them, and they restore and are rich in abundance for all with a kind of sweetness, beauty, clarity, suavity, and every kind of desirable outpouring as from the breast of the Word. In sum, Gallus here posits a cognitive modality in which the soul is most affected by what it encounters. It's super intellectual in that it is beyond concept, but it is not super cognitional, where cognition is defined as any mode of perception or awareness. It is an affective cognition, even as it differs from the properly intellectual kind of cognition. Now, this account of seraphic affectivity already, I would suggest, undermines any simplistic antagonism between knowledge and love, undergirding an anti-intellectualist charge often leveled against Gallus. But there's more. Above, in the quote 6, I believe, on your handout, Gallus refers to the brilliant burnings and the burning brilliances of the seraphic mode. This blending of the signature metaphors, brilliant cherubic light and burning seraphic fire, signals a final form of simplification, a final integration of the two cognitional modes hitherto distinguished from each other. This is quote 9 on your handout. The most chaste love encircles the mind and contracts and narrows all its movements into the desire for the one simple highest good. This drawing together is a straightened simplification of the mind. Now the multiple cognitions of the invisible divine things are contained under that simplicity of participation, which is perceived in the inmost contemplation of the sublime theoria. The soul thus arrives at an experiential cognition of true love. In short, at the seraphic summit, the soul's powers are simplified or contracted into a single affective modality, where the affectus sublimates the intellect, suspending its proper rational and intellectual activity, such that what was distinct at lower levels is here synthesized and integrated into an affective singularity. Put simply, I would argue, the affectus is the consummation of all the lower aspects of the soul. All of this occurs hierarchically, that is to say, in an ascending and assimilating sublimation, the lower subsumed into the higher. Now, it's often assumed that this affective cognition is the stopping point of Gallus's mystical theology. But in the passage above, number 6 again, Gallus observes at the very end, quote, "From this seraphic order, the flood of the divine light flows into the lower orders, one by one." This introduces a crucial feature of his mystical theology, namely that of descent. As a hierarchy, the soul has a descending vector, a downward movement, where what is received at the highest point flows down into the lower orders and is received by them in their own proper mode. Quote, "The bridegroom distributes one by one into each of my inferior orders according to the capacity of each," end quote. This has crucial implications for intellectual cognition and indeed for the very nature of the theological enterprise. This is quote 10 on your handout. Gallus insists that precisely in its proper intellectual modality, the intellectus benefits intellectually from affective union. Quote, "The groom commends this fountain from the principle inflowing, namely the affectual inflowing, which is like a fountain of intellectual things or of inflowings of understandings. Like a light rain, this influx refills and refreshes every capacity of the mind that has been extended to receive it." Or again, quote, "Brought to union, the affectus engenders incomparably brighter lights in the intellect," end quote. In short, from the darkness of affective union comes a torrent of intellectual understandings, which Gallus consistently evokes in the language of illumination, as, quote, light poured from the seraphim one by one into the inferior orders, end quote. Interestingly, Gallus claims that this is the origin of the speculative Trinitarian theology of his Victorine predecessor, Richard of St. Victor, who on the Trinity, quote, established a new theological science upon the experience of the affectus, end quote. This is quote 11 on your handout. Quote, often by the experience of burning charity, the mind is illuminated and strengthened in no small way as to how to apprehend the articles of the Trinity. Already held by faith, how those things are now to be understood thus, and ought not nor cannot be otherwise, even though it does not understand them fully. For Gallus, then, affective cognition illumines the intellect. It abounds in speculative insight. This descending movement from higher to lower levels is thus aptly characterized as a cascading illumination. So, in conclusion, Gallus's mysticism is governed by his anthropology, wherein the soul is conceived of as a hierarchy, a dynamic state containing both ascending and descending vectors. These are not discrete processes. Ascent is not unidirectional, not a unidirectional movement that ceases once it's completed. It's not a ladder that one ascends and then leaves behind. Rather, it overflows, descending back down into the lower orders. But neither does descent lead to cessation. The dynamism of ascending and descending is always present, like the angels on Jacob's ladder, which Gallus actually explicitly evokes. This stable dynamism is the anthropological correlate to the third dimension of Dionysian metaphysics, namely remaining. See if I can switch this slide now. Good. Turning to Lonergan. The modest goal here is to highlight some features of his anthropology that are most salient in relationship to Gallus, namely Lonergan's notion of consciousness. Like Gallus, Lonergan sees a macrocosm-microcosm relation between the structure of being generally and of human being in particular. He posits a metaphysics of a dynamic and emerging universe, which he calls generalized emergent probability, a universe that includes the drama of human history. In Lonergan's metaphysics, quote, there is a hierarchy of grades of being in an objectively ordered universe, end quote. Lower grades of being set the condition for the emergence of higher grades, which in turn order the lower grades from which they emerge. The universe is also characterized by finality, the fact that being is open to and directed upward toward higher levels of organization and integration. Lonergan's universe is thus governed teleologically by a dynamic process of emergence, which sets the conditions for higher levels of integration of lower levels of being. And importantly, this generalized emergent probability also structures human being, including human consciousness. Consciousness, it's actually almost going to perfectly line up. Consciousness for Lonergan is a dynamic structure. That is to say, it's composed of distinct parts that have a functional relationship to each other, and the entire entity tends toward its own self-realization, like a biological organism. Each stage of its development depends on the previous stage out of which it arises and anticipates the next stages. More precisely, consciousness is composed for Lonergan of four distinct acts. First of all, the empirical.
Sorry.
talk amongst yourselves. Actually, I think we can, when it finally comes, we'll be fine. So the four distinct acts. First of all, the empirical, involving sense experience and also inner experiences or states of feeling. For example, hunger or anxiety. Second of all, the intellectual, involving understanding. Thirdly, the rational or reasonable, involving judgment. And then finally, fourth, the responsible, involving decision and action. Each of these is cognitional and intentional. That is to say, each has its own proper object. And each, moreover, is irreducibly distinct from the others. Finally, Lonergan organizes them vertically as distinct levels of consciousness, insofar as, on the one hand, an act presupposes other acts as the condition of the possibility for its emergence, and, on the other hand, fulfills in part the conditions for the emergence of subsequent acts. Just pause there and let you catch up with. So there are the first four levels: the empirical, the intelligent, the rational, and the responsible. Talk about the top one in a second. These cognitional acts, moreover, are interrelated in a regular and self-assembling order. Consciousness unfolds sequentially through them due to the dynamism of the human spirit, which emerges in questions about the intelligible, which pertains to intellectual understanding, about the true, which pertains to rational judgment, and about the good, which pertains to moral and responsible decision. Empirical experience, such as sensing and imagining, precedes and gives rise to questions pertaining to intellectual understanding, where acts of understanding and formulations of one's understanding occur. Questions about the correctness of understanding give rise to rational judgment, where one seeks sufficient evidence for affirming or denying the truth or falsity of one's understanding. Finally, questions for deliberation arise, where feelings apprehend values and where one makes decisions about who one will be and how one will live. The process thus unfolds from the sensible to the intelligible, from the intelligible to the true, and from the true to the good. So for Lonergan, consciousness is a dynamic structure constituted by these irreducibly distinct cognitional acts, which emerge in this particular interrelated and interdependent way, namely from experience through understanding and judgment and towards deliberation and decision. In a word, consciousness for Lonergan, like it was for Gallus, is polymorphic. Like Gallus, Lonergan orders the different levels of consciousness hierarchically. For the Jesuit, this means that one must be conscious in a particular way, according to a particular mode, as the condition of the possibility of eliciting certain kinds of acts of consciousness. One can imagine or perceive without being intelligently, rationally, or responsibly conscious. One can simply imagine. But one cannot understand in the strict sense of having an insight without being intelligently conscious. But one can and even must imagine and understand while rationally and responsibly conscious. Levels then help make sense of the fact that while an act can occur on any appropriately high level of consciousness, there is a lowest level of consciousness below which it cannot occur. And although certain lower level acts of consciousness can occur without higher level acts, such higher level acts presuppose the lower level acts as the condition of their possibility. For example, one cannot understand without having first imagined. Understanding always presupposes experience. Even if one's imagining takes place while one is intelligently conscious, that is, as one is trying to understand, and is therefore saturated, so to speak, with the quality of intelligent rather than merely empirical consciousness. As the subject moves to higher levels of operation, the preceding levels and acts therein are affected positively, enhanced, or given a new and broader context. Lonergan deploys the term sublation to describe this in text 14 on your, or 12 on your handout. I would use sublation to mean that what sublates goes beyond what is sublated, introduces something new and distinct, puts everything on a new basis. Yet, so far from interfering with the sublated or destroying it, on the contrary, needs it, includes it, preserves all its proper features and properties, and carries them forward to a fuller realization within a richer context. End quote. As an example, Lonergan describes the fourth level of consciousness and how it sublates the lower ones. This is text 13. The fourth level of deliberation, evaluation, decision, and action sublates the prior levels of experience, understanding, and judging. It goes beyond them, sets up a new principle and type of operation, directs them to a new goal, but so far from dwarfing them, preserves them and brings them to a fuller fruition, end quote. That is to say, when the subject is operating responsibly on the fourth level, all acts below it can be responsible acts. They're taken up into a larger context by the deliberating and deciding subject who operates on a higher level and in a wider world. Such lower level acts then are fecundated insofar as their significance expands when the subject enters into that larger world. The lower levels are permeated or saturated by the quality of consciousness that accompanies the higher. For example, when one is operating rationally, the quality of consciousness that permeates an act of imagination may itself be rational rather than merely empirical. So there is also something of a descending movement here. The higher flows into the lower. For example, the goal of an act of imagination by a deliberating subject in level 4 is not simply the free play of imagination. It's not simply understanding. It has as its goal both the understanding of different possible courses of action, which the subject may deliberate about and decide upon, and also the elicitation of different feelings that intend values which aid in the deliberation. In fact, the concern to make a good decision influences how and what one imagines. Yet deliberation would be impossible without imagination. Again, before one understands, one intelligently manipulates images in the imagination until one gets an insight. So that's ascending. But once one is understood, one can conjure a variety of different images to evoke the same insight. Fred Lawrence, my BC colleague, has suggested that these ascending and descending movements may be seen as, quote, two distinct vectors of human development, and has dubbed them the way of achievement and the way of heritage. The way of achievement is the process of self-transcendence as it emerges from the bottom up, from experience through insight, formulation, critical understanding and judgment, and finally to evaluation, decision, commitment, and even to love. And this movement, though, is complemented by the way from above downward, or the way of heritage. What was achieved in the ascent is now received in the subsequent descent as a new source, in order to begin the process all over again. But the metaphor of descent is still apt in light of the notion of sublation noted above. What is achieved in the higher levels of consciousness redounds into the lower levels as a kind of new inheritance or heritage, gifting them with new meaning and intensity. Importantly, because the apex of the ascending vector is the sphere of value, of choice, indeed of love, when this descends or flows back down into the lower levels, it does so as a preceding gift that then funds the way of achievement to occur all over again. Described thus far is Lonergan's basic account of human nature and consciousness. But like Gallus, he also addresses the introduction and presence of grace within this account. As a gift, grace is a new supernatural reality in the human. This reception of grace comes about through a religious conversion in which the gift of God's love is poured into the heart through the Holy Spirit, such that the human person is now, quote, in love with God in an unrestricted fashion, end quote. Lonergan's construal of this state of grace as being in love with God in an unrestricted fashion is crucial. This is an actual state of the human being in which divine love becomes its fundamental determination, part of its concrete existence. More specifically, this being in love with God is a reorientation of the human person toward its end in God. More precisely, it is a reorientation of consciousness, Godward, towards what Lonergan calls transcendent lovableness. But this orientation of consciousness is not first and foremost a particular act of consciousness or something that enters thematically into focal awareness. Rather, it is prior to and principle of subsequent acts of consciousness. It is an orientation of consciousness that conditions and permeates all other conscious activity. Thus, grace, or being in love with God, is present and operative in all conscious acts, but in such a way that it's not necessarily noticed. Yet, this ontological presence of grace tends dynamically toward psychological awareness or consciousness. And Lonergan calls this emerging awareness religious consciousness, a change of awareness both in everyday life as well as in prayer, brought about by grace. It could be called Christian consciousness, since it's explicitly linked to an encounter with the Holy Spirit and to conversion and to the Spirit's ongoing presence in the human person. And it's precisely here that McGinn has introduced the notion of mystical consciousness, noted above. Mystical consciousness is a further differentiation, expansion, development, or cultivation of this religious consciousness. It's an especially intense awareness of the presence of grace, a psychologically conscious abiding in the awareness of God's love. But this gradual emergence of graced consciousness plays out, so to speak, throughout the hierarchical levels of human consciousness. On the one hand, it occurs along the ascending vector, the way of achievement. Religious and especially mystical consciousness are the emergence of a new higher modality of consciousness in which we respond to the gift of grace and move ever deeper into an abiding in the immediacy of God's love. And here again, the higher sublates the lower. But such consciousness is not just a gift that stops at the level of a new special perception or experience of God. By the way, this would be level 5, as you might have guessed already. It doesn't stop there. It also involves the way in which this perception restructures the subject's drive to understand, affirm, and live out the gift received. Being in love affects how and what one senses, imagines, understands, judges, decides, and acts. In this sense, it also occurs along the descending vector, the way of heritage. And here the higher again saturates the lower. Construed thus, it accords neatly with the Pauline notion of God's love flooding the heart, by which being in love with God percolates down into the lower levels of consciousness. At the same time, this love is the call to self-transcendence that animates the dynamic unfolding of consciousness from below upwards. And so love animates all conscious activity from within. We might say then that here, mystical consciousness, 5th level, functions in a dual way, as both summit and then source, as goal and ground, as end and beginning. But crucially, it also remains one particular moment or dimension within the totality of human consciousness. Love does not collapse or dispense with the polymorphic structure of human consciousness. Seen as a totality, graced human existence, its dynamic movement toward greater intensification of the presence of divine love at all levels of consciousness, it seems apt to speak of love-saturated God consciousness. The ontological reality of divine love is present at every level of human existence. Love permeates the whole, but rather than supplant or suppress the other levels, it fructifies and fulfills them. All right, for the sake of time, I'm going to shift to a conclusion. Despite the centuries that separate them, Gallus and Lonergan, viewing them synthetically or even synoptically, so to speak, is fruitful. To begin, both espouse a hierarchical anthropology and both posit an affective or love-based mystical consciousness at the apex or high point of their hierarchies, as in some way the goal and summit of the spiritual life. For both, this is the gift of God's grace present in human consciousness. As goal, mystical consciousness is the terminus of lower modes of consciousness. For Gallus, in an ascending vector, rational and intellectual cognition lead to and are assimilated by affective cognition. For Lonergan, in the way of achievement, empirical, intellectual, rational, and responsible consciousness are sublated by religious and even mystical consciousness. For both, moreover, the essential affectivity of mystical consciousness is conceived of similarly. In itself, this affectivity is devoid of conceptual or nomadic content. It is super intellectual. Yet in some way, this affectivity assimilates and simplifies and so consummates the lower forms of cognition or modes of consciousness. For both, then, there is a continuity between knowledge and love in the ascending vector, despite the genuine differences that they both insist on between the intellectual and the affective modalities. Here, in some sense, you can't love what you don't know. And so intellect precedes but leads to affect. And knowledge gives birth to love, even as love exceeds and surpasses knowledge. You might say that there is a continuity of consciousness or of cognition, even as the modality of consciousness changes. And lastly, this affective apex is also the moment where the divine other is encountered, not scientifically or abstractly or objectively, but interpersonally, as another subject, as the beloved. But that's not the end. For both thinkers also insist that affective experience or mystical consciousness is also the ground and source of the other forms of cognition or modes of consciousness that are genuine and indeed integral parts of human existence. In the descending vector for Gallus, or the way of heritage for Lonergan, affective cognition cascades down into intellectual and rational cognition. Or for Lonergan, mystical consciousness suffuses judgment, understanding, and perception. Here, love is the prior condition of the possibility of knowledge. Affect precedes but leads to intellect. Love gives birth to knowledge, even as knowledge engages its object intellectually. The lover, already united to the beloved, is still eager to descend into lower forms of knowledge about the beloved. Analogously, the one who has tasted and seen that the Lord is good still wishes to understand intellectually, maybe especially wishes to understand intellectually, to understand how that Lord who is lover is also both three and one, is still eager, perhaps especially eager, to meditate on divine power and wisdom and goodness as they are manifest in creation or in salvation history. That one still longs, perhaps especially longs, to conceptualize the deep wisdom of the Paschal mystery. And even if those are woefully inadequate and far inferior to the sweetness of the beloved's kiss, they are not, therefore, negligible or superfluous or nugatory, let alone inimical. Rather, they are born of the kiss. They are genuine, irreducible goods in themselves, and the lover yearns for them as such, even if love ultimately transcends them. In fact, such sense experience and knowledge and understanding do tend towards self-transcendence, even towards self-denial and abnegation, but that does not at all render them unimportant or unnecessary. In fact, just the opposite. And so here, too, a real significant continuity exists between love and knowledge in Gallus's descending vector, or in Lonergan's way of heritage. In sum, it seems apt to me to speak of the mystical theologies of both Gallus and Lonergan as love-saturated God consciousness, as both offer accounts of the mystical element in Christian existence that focuses on human consciousness in all of its dimensions, and in which love can be seen to suffuse or saturate the whole.
Thank you, Roy. Thank you so much for such a rich presentation of the medieval and the modern and converging in such a great way. And I know we have a bunch of Lonergan people out here, so I can't wait to let go. So we do have time for conversation and questions. So, Shimsu, please.
In my limited understanding of Dionysius, the hierarchy is a hierarchy of imitation, the lower imitating the higher, and through the gradation and the ascension and high ascension is a scale of contemplation, participation, and fellowship.
Mm-hmm.
He uses those three words, and I think he also throws in semblance. So based on that, my understanding is that in order to understand the higher from the lower, you need symbol to understand the higher.
Symbol?
Yeah, symbols.
Yeah.
Yeah. So is that what we find? Is this okay? So my question is symbol has a role in all levels of hierarchy in Dionysius and in Lonergan? I mean, Gallus.
It's a great question. I suppose it depends on, there's Dionysius, the Dionysian text is full of symbolism, and he uses symbols to try to explain what he's arguing for. At the same time, it seems like some of the Dionysian levels are actually explicitly devoid of any kind of symbolism, namely the final ascent, especially as described in the mystical theology, where Moses enters the dark cloud, the cloud of unknowing. There you have no symbolic mediation whatsoever in Dionysius, it seems to me. Dionysius and symbol, I'm not sure what else to say. More dissertation was on this liturgical symbol. There's lots of use and deployment of symbolism in Dionysius' theology. So maybe that we can just leave it there for that part. Gallus also uses a lot of symbolic language to describe the different levels and the movement between them. Whether or not the movement between them is actually mediated by interaction with symbols, which I gather maybe that is your question. Yeah, I'd have to think about that more. Not sure. And even less so am I sure about Lonergan. We'd be happy to have some Lonergan help with that respect.
Not directly on this, but I was wondering, this is more a question for Gallus or about Gallus, but it's very much sort of, I guess.
I'm trying to channel it as much as I can. So
it's a question that's inspired in some way by Lonergan. So Lonergan, for Lonergan, the act of understanding is in some way suffered. We can question, and even our questions are in some way suffered, right?
Yeah,
like we can't force ourselves to have genuine questions. They kind of come to us, and then we want to know. But the act of understanding is also suffered too. Like there are conditions for the act of understanding. You'd have to think through the issue and really try to figure it out. And you have to employ your imagination, do work. But it's also in some way suffered. And I'm wondering with Gallus, the way he's using intellectus, is intellectus, well, first of all, is it an act of understanding? And second of all, is it suffered in some way? Or is it, when he uses seeing and hearing, it seems like there's kind of like conscious control over it or something like that.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's very much suffered. I mean, the short answer to your question is that, and I mean, Gallus uses that very interesting language of sort of the shift from convex to concave, right? And but in its dominical mode, I'm sorry, you can't talk about Gallus without using this strange language. But in its dominical mode, it's much more initiating and active. But when it kind of ascends into the higher triad and it sort of flips over, now becomes a concavity. It has to be drawn by grace. Gallus got this interesting language of the attracted intellect and the attracted affect. They aren't capable on their own of operating in that highest level, and so it's both are very much undergoing divine things. Absolutely, and Gallus loves to quote that Hierothian.
Can you expound upon this way of heritage or expound upon Lonergan's understanding of this way of heritage and the actual experience of history?
In the experience of what?
Of history. Across time.
Like a not an individual person, but
But across time.
Like through communities or through human history or something like that. No. Okay. Lonerganians here have an answer. I don't know if Lonergan has an account of a kind of evolution. I mean, I know he does actually have an account of sort of a kind of an evolutionary account of the development of human consciousness. But insofar as that might be correlated with the way of heritage, I don't know. I'm really a kind of a novice with respect to Lonergan, and I'm happy to admit that.
It exists.
Okay.
John and then Fritz.
Yeah, very briefly on that point about history, the account of grace in chapter 4, Method and Theology, the back half of that book is trying to expound a method for collaboratively cognizing the way of heritage in history. So it's that account of grace is ordered towards the question of history in that book. My question is about the sort of fourth and fifth levels of consciousness as represented here in relationship to the McGinn's distinction that you invoked at the beginning.
Yeah.
Because there's as is always as everyone's great fear, right, is you venture out with a new figure and there's a body of nerds who've already worked on it a bunch who have a fight that you're going to step into. And there is one about the distinctness of the fourth and fifth levels, right? And so because he says that the being in love in an unrestricted fashion is conscious in this fourth level way. There gets some development later. Jeremy Blackwood writes a book. But I asked that it seems like a place where the McGinn distinction would be really relevant between just spirituality and mysticism, but I'm not as familiar with McGinn's distinction. So am I onto something? Is there?
If I'm tracking your question, would you say, are you asking if religious consciousness goes in level 4 and mystical consciousness would be a way of describing this possible existence of a fifth level or
I mean, the way that you characterize McGinn's distinction is that the mystical is an integral but distinct aspect of this broader, more general spiritual
religious consciousness.
Yes. And so my question is, is that maybe a parallel or a proxy for that ambiguity between responsible consciousness and being in love and or
Yeah, it's a great question. And I mean, the thing with the McGinn article is he just kind of tosses this out. It's not anything that he fully develops at all. And so I don't know if he was thinking about that. And I am vaguely aware of this inter-Lonerganian debate about whether there is this fifth level or not. But from what you're saying, it seems like it's plausible that the mystical consciousness might be a way of. Yeah, exactly.
Hashing that out. That's interesting. Thanks.
Fritz first and then Sarah.
So in some ways, this is kind of related to this mystical consciousness question. So I'm thinking about Aquinas's Vetula. The old woman who knows more about God, the old woman with faith who knows more about God than the greatest philosopher, right? Mm-hmm. And I'm trying to fit the Vetula into particularly Lonergan's scheme. And I'm not a Lonerganian, as will become apparent, but, both through my ignorance and other things. But I think I know enough about Lonergan to say that he would say, well, the Vetula who has faith, she's got all the levels of consciousness going, right? Which I do kind of find in some ways implausible. But I guess my question is really a question to McGinn, which is, the old woman with faith, who in some ways, I suppose, has a God-saturated consciousness. I'm just wondering, do you want to say she's a mystic? If you say, she spends her days, feeding the chickens. I always imagine her on a farm for some reason. Feeding the chickens, milking the cows, threshing the hay, whatever. And it just seems to me the desire to say, well, she has mystical consciousness, in some ways takes the term mysticism and makes it so generally applicable that it really loses all specific meaning. Right? So everybody who has faith, there's really essentially no difference between the Vetula working on her farm and in Siena.
Well, I think the thing was, again, I'll certainly welcome the Lonerganian answer into this, but I'll just give an initial shot. I think this structure is a dynamic and developmental structure, and so you could be inhabiting it, and it could be kind of organizing your consciousness in all kinds of different levels of sophistication, right? And so it seems to me that you could imagine that every individual or every graced individual, or even has some dimension or some element of these different levels of consciousness, even as that they might still be very, I don't know, this is maybe not the right way to say, but underdeveloped or immature or whatever than someone else in whom there's been a kind of depth of intensification and growth and maturation or whatever.
So I'm thinking maybe my problem is more with McGinn than with Lonergan.
I think I'm sympathetic a little bit to McGinn's attempt to try to do some democratization of mysticism and not make it. What your problem is Gallus has a much worse problem with your question than Lonergan does, right? I think Lonergan's got a way of thinking about every human person having a kind of a mystical dimension to their life or their spirituality. It's harder to take what I've just described from Gallus and sort of apply that, universally.
Yeah, but you look at McGinn's history of mysticism. There's no vetulism there, right? There's no old ladies who. What do you think so?
There's Brother Lawrence, right? There's you have these examples. The one way of thinking about this is to say, are you saying that the Vetula is incapable of union with God?
No, but I'm not saying. But I guess part of what I would be saying is, but does the term mysticism actually, is it voided of any kind of utility to talk about a particular kind of consciousness of God, not just any consciousness of God, right?
But I think Lonergan is trying to carve out it isn't just any consciousness. In a way, all of these are different levels of God consciousness, but the mystical would be this particularly intense moment of psychologically, self-aware awareness of divine presence or something along those lines.
And I guess I'm wondering how the Vetula could know more about God than the greatest philosopher if she doesn't have a kind of a psychological self-awareness of
what it means for her to know more.
Exactly. Yeah. What does that mean? Does it have to be thematized, discursive, described? Because the difference that you're talking about is people who articulate and write down or mystical texts. Really what Bernie is tracing in that history is a history of mystical texts. But these texts are representative samples of a possible human awareness.
It's just very, very briefly on Lonergan. It's very, very important not to hear intellectual and rational consciousness and think theoretical.
Right.
That the theoretical and the broader modalities of ways of engaging just lived life are distinct functions that are structured the same way.
Sarah.
Well, I was just going to say, I think, not to advertise my own mentor, but Andrew Cravo is coming out with a book on the mysticism of ordinary life, which I think might be very interesting for this conversation. And I certainly think the woman with the chickens is a mystic. Athanasius, was taken to a shoemaker by an angel and told, this person knows more than you. So Athanasius was certainly a great philosopher and theologian. But my question, I suppose, jumping off of Fritz, and I'm going to go ahead and apologize to Jonathan because we've already discoursed about this on Twitter. And I do promise I read your replies, but I'm interested in knowing.
Share with the crowd.
Class, Boyd, my question is jumping off of Fritz, but it's less about sophistication and more about ability. And I'm wondering, with this kind of hierarchical anthropology, even though it's culminating in a love which is saturated, it relies very much on intellect, rationality, responsibility, which does require a kind of normative understanding of cognitional ability. And I'm just wondering, for those who don't fit into that category, what is the possibility for union with God, knowledge, alternative epistemologies, these sorts of things? And of course, this is not Gallus's question, but I'm interested in if you have any kind of speculation on that.
Are you talking about people with impairment or disability?
Yes, yeah.
Well,
Well, also children, right? There's development there that doesn't fit into normativity in the way that I think is being talked about here.
when you say normativity, you just mean sort of.
The people in this room.
Yeah, you just mean the way that human minds or whatever tend to function or whatever, rather than in situations when they're impaired or something. It's a great question, and it's been raised a lot, and I don't know how to answer that. Neither one of these thinkers, I think, are trying to deal directly with. Frankly, though, it still seems to me, again, I'll invite the experts, but the Lonergan's thinker seems to be very, very adaptable. It seems very, very, you could deploy it or use it in vastly different contexts with vastly different capacities. And still have something that seems like it would read.
Whatever, we can pull the conversation back in time a bit, because why not? So when you were talking about Gallus, I was just thinking, it was really pulling up in my mind not just the sort of spatial conceptual dynamics of the Dionysian hierarchy, but this weird kind of mnemotechnic text from Hugo St. Victor, right? The De Formazione archive, which it just seems on the face of it to be this tour de force of mnemotechnesis, so how do you memorize everything in the Bible and the whole descent of all the popes and everything, and with this gigantic arc-shaped memory palace, which seems to be all that it is, right? But it starts with this wildly memorable description of drawing a cubit, which is the cross with the Lamb of God on it, and then this various color symbolism. And then everything kind of flows out from that. And then he starts shooting it up and up and up and up and up, and all these different stories and all these different stories and all these different stories, that then eventually becomes this infinitely capacious memory palace that holds all of salvation history and all that the mind can hold. That then also kind of collapses back down. That everything sort of comes from is reaching up to and being pulled up by the ever ascending cross of Jesus Christ. And everything spills back down from it. That this is the main mast, the literal main mast from which all of human cognition hangs, that holds everything together and that spills back down from it. And I don't know. I mean, I'm not saying that Gallus had this text in mind, but there is a kind of what Hugh is doing by architectonic, physical, like mental analogy seems very related to the kind of noetic structure that you're describing with Gallus, with a very strong emphasis that what is doing the ascending and descending drama is the attractive and superabundant outpouring force of the cross of Jesus Christ.
Well, yeah, so great. And there's a lot of things to say there. The first thing is that you're exactly right. The Victorines tend to think with symbols. And so Hugh has Noah's Ark, Richard has the Ark of the Covenant, and Gallus has what for Gallus is also a biblical symbol, right? I mean, for Gallus, Dionysius is Paul's, the Dionysian corpus might as well be scripture, right? So each of these three great Victorines has a master symbol, which is essentially biblically derived, through which they think about everything, right? So they use symbols to do all of their thinking. And at the same time, they're not just mnemonic devices or ways of organizing a bunch of theological ideas. They are also programmatic technologies for the spiritual life, right? So for Hugh, Hugh's got that great big ark, but really what Hugh says to all of his brothers is build your own ark, which is the soul, right? You have to actually, do the same thing in yourself. You yourself are an edifice. And then it correlates with all the levels of scripture and everything else. So you just have this program of the spiritual life that's symbolically sort of organized. And I think you're exactly right. The angelic hierarchy is doing exactly the same thing for Gallus.
Thanks, Boyd. I have a horribly elementary question, and it's about Gallus. So you describe the soul as, characterized by Gallus as a dynamic state containing both ascending and descending vectors. And what I'm puzzled by, and I realize I've never been puzzled by this in Plotinus say, and I probably should have been, is what's the temporality of this? In other words, are the vectors ascending and descending all the time? Are all these levels available all the time? Or is it a sort of progression? Is it in what state for the human being are these levels accessed?
Part of me likes to try to say, well, they're always in play, and it's a kind of this dynamic simultaneity. But I don't think that psychologically works very well. And so I think that psychologically speaking, or maybe even phenomenologically speaking, there is a sense in which you could talk about a sequence, so ascending and then descending and then ascending and descending, and so that there would be this sense of when he describes Richard as having this kind of this intellectual insight from a mystical experience, one imagines that, and I don't know if this was some kind of intra-Victorine tradition about what happened to Richard in the 1160s that Gallus is still repeating 50 years later, but that all of a sudden Richard's praying or contemplating or having some kind of profound mystical consciousness, and some sort of insight comes to him, and then he's then he's writing De Trinitate, and he's no longer in a mystical mode of consciousness, but in a very intellectual, speculative sort of set of exercises.
Potentiality going on. I mean, are the seraphim potentially available to you, but it's only in certain moments that you access.
Right. Exactly. Yeah.
So I was wondering if Gallus is drawing intentionally or explicitly on Gregory the Great's homily 34 on the celestial hierarchy. So this is where Gregory the Great gets into the celestial hierarchy, and he does something like this with human knowledge, not at this level of sophistication, but he's doing it. And I know the Victorines are so interested in Gregory's mystical theology. I'm just wondering if that comes up in Gallus, as that's a source for him or not.
It's a good question. I don't recall any place where he's explicitly alluding to Gregory, frankly, I've just always taken it for granted that all of his angelology and all of his sort of all the angelic stuff was coming from Dionysius and never.
That's where Gregory's getting it too, which is interesting. Yeah, so I'm just wondering if they're doing a parallel thing here.
I don't know of any explicit reference to Gregory.
Thanks.
Thank you for your talk. You may say you don't want to answer this question because I'm asking about a thinker that you don't want to talk about. I don't know. But as I was listening to you talk about Gallus, who I don't know directly, I found myself listening, thinking through the Dionysian that I know best, which is Bonaventure.
Yeah.
Particularly chapter 4 of the Itinerarium. Right? Lots of parallels.
Yeah.
And then I heard Bonaventure yelling in my ear in this recent tiff about the woman with the chickens and intellectual.
Just to be clear, Thomas doesn't specify anything about chickens.
I like the detail, yeah.
I thought about Bonaventure and Francis on this question of the simple pious devotion that is intimately present to God. Would you be willing to say something about how Gallus is and is not Bonaventure?
Yeah. So, first of all, I think Gallus's influence on Bonaventure is woefully underappreciated and undernoticed. You're here.
Thanks for calling on me, guys.
Chapter 4 of the Itinerarium, although here's one of the things interesting about both the use of the influence of Gallus, but also Bonaventure doing something different. For Bonaventure, at least as I read that 4th chapter, grace hierarchizes the soul. Whereas for Gallus, the soul is already naturally a hierarchy. And so there's an interesting.
Well, it restores the soul's hierarchy.
Well, okay, so maybe so maybe at the end of the day, there's not a huge difference between the two, but at least in the explicit, or at least the way it's easy to read Bonaventure is that the grace is doing the hierarchizing of the soul, and before the advent of grace, there's something less hierarchical or non-hierarchical. That's one thing. I think the final chapter of Itinerarium has got Gallus' fingerprints all over it in terms of the movement into affectivity. Bonaventure even quotes Gallus's favorite biblical passages. The only one who knows it's the one who's received it. Job, my soul chooses hanging in death. Gallus loves those, and Bonaventure quotes them all the time. What Gallus doesn't have is Francis. So what you don't get in Francis or in Gallus is attention to the crucified Christ. Now, what I would argue is that what's been underappreciated in Gallus, which is not very explicit in his commentaries on Dionysius, which was what was known about Gallus in the affective Dionysius reception that Gallus is the originator of, and influences people like Bonaventure and others, a cloud of unknowing later on. What you don't have there, which you have much more in the song commentaries, is a pneumatically and Christologically sort of organized or mediated movement through we don't have the right thing, but through the angelic hierarchy, right? There's lots of Christological language, lots of pneumatic language about the way in which this movement from cherubic intellection to seraphic affection involves Christological and pneumatological, participation or connection or whatever. And I think the death of the intellect for Gallus, right, is a Paschal sort of thing. It is a moment of participation in it is not really super explicit about the cross, but I think there's enough of the way that he talks about it that it's there. But he doesn't have the element of Francis. And I think what Bonaventure adds into the Galusian mix is a lot of stuff that's not quite there in Gallus, but I think the potential is there. It doesn't have to really rework Gallus very much for Bonaventure to bring Francis in.
So with all the talk about affectus in Gallus, I never heard you say voluntas. And so I think about William of St. Thierry, he has a distinction between intellectus and affectus intellectus. And so my two questions are, one, where is voluntas, or does it come into Gallus at all? And then I know your emphasis was on sort of, and I would prefer ecstatic experience to distinguish from, I think that mystical experience, I think every Christian is mystical, but in an ecstatic something different. But I'm curious, how does beatific vision sort of fit how does it affect this hierarchical structure? And Gauss is just coming up to these debates on whether or not there's a habitus that makes beatific vision possible. So does he have a notion of light of glory, lumen glory? So those are my three: will,
Yeah.
beatific vision, then light of glory in Gauss.
Yeah. In reverse order, no, not a lot of discussion of that more scholastically located. And I think what happens is, Gallus leaves Paris in 1219. He never comes back. Right? And he's in Vercelli for the rest of his life, obsessed with the Dionysian corpus and the Song of Songs, right? In love, yeah, exactly. Might be. And so, the subsequent debates at Paris and the subsequent scholastic conversation, I think he really kind of gets left behind by that or whatever. The first part of your question is, I think, very interesting because no, voluntas is not part of the anthropology. It's much more 12th century, right? For the 12th century folks, affectus more often is the faculty or the capacity that later on becomes kind of assimilated to voluntas. I think with some negative fallout. I think something's lost when we shift from affectus to voluntas. Voluntas ends up having to do too much work in terms of all the different things that we ask voluntas to do. And I think affectus is an important anthropology. It would take too long to kind of parse it all out, but that's the thesis that I'll someday argue is that we need to recover. Somebody tried to do this with Rousseau, the philosopher at Marquette.
Talon?
Yeah, thank you. With triadic consciousness and to distinguish intellect and voluntas and affect as all three of them necessary for a more robust or comprehensive account of the human consciousness.
One more, Aaron.
I wonder if you could say something about the genre of this being a song commentary for Gallus. So, this isn't one of the known streams of song commentaries, and it doesn't become one of the known streams of song commentaries. And you mentioned that, his organizing biblical image is the angelic hierarchy. But we've got this other biblical image, which is the bride and the bridegroom. And I'm thinking too of Hugh of Balma's Roads to Zion Morn, where there's this line where he says all of scripture is the inner colloquy of the bride and the bridegroom. And then he reads the Lord's Prayer down through that. So I'm wondering what he can do through this genre and through these images that he couldn't do otherwise, because I don't want to think that it's just like a pretense for him to lay out his system and have a sort of thin veneer of biblical authority or something. So what is it like?
Yeah, so you're exactly right that Gallus's song commentaries, remain hidden in obscurity. It seems like nobody knows them. And I think that's part of why he's been misunderstood. Gallus says at the beginning of the song commentary, in terms of mystical theology, Dionysius provides the theory, the Song of Songs provides the practice. So Solomon is the one who tells us what this actually feels like, or kind of describes the actual practice of it. Dionysius is the theoretician. So what he does then is to fuse Dionysius and the Song of Songs. So it reads very oddly. So, it really does. So, he starts engaging the song and he'll say, when the bride says, let him kiss me with the kiss of the mouth. Well, that's the bride in the dominions, right? And so he's constantly locating the various phrases in the Song of Songs someplace in the angelic hierarchy and then interpreting in light of that location in the angelic hierarchy. So it's a very odd fusion of Dionysius and the song. Where you get this very strange way of interpreting the Song of Songs as being kind of, it's just all organized anthropologically according to the angelic hierarchy. It's different things that the bride says are, she's speaking out of the seraphim, or she's speaking out of the thrones, and then he interprets it accordingly. I don't know if that answers your question.
I mean, it does. I wonder what prompted him to have this sort of remarkable line that, the Song of Songs is this mystical theology. I mean, other than he's really interested in both, other than that the song is the highest, book really in the Bible. Is it just that it's so, the sort of language of love merges so nicely with sort of affective?
Yeah, well, I mean, certainly I think that what makes it to him feel like it works. I mean, and these again, Dionysius is a basically sub-apostolic, right? It's basically a scriptural text for Gallus. And so, yeah, I mean, and he's like all the medievals, he's synthesizing his authorities. And so he's got to figure out a way that they go together. song and Dionysius.